In this short lecture, I'm going to give some pointers to how to develop a research question. But first, it should be asked, is it necessary to formulate a research question at all? If you already know what you want to study, isn't it just a matter of starting the research project? To some extent, I want to answer yes to such a question. First, there are research traditions that do not always make use of research questions. For example, this is quite common in my primary research field, which is within philosophy and ethics. Many of the papers that we write are argumentative. There is, of course, a need to explain to the reader what he or she is about to read, but it isn't necessarily important to state a research question. Here, we generally are satisfied with stating a purpose with our paper. I usually address this question when talking about research questions, and that it is what the difference is between the purpose or question or academic article. The answers that I have experienced as the most satisfactory is that purpose is about the goals you have with the study. That is what your intentions are with the study. The research question is instead about restricting the objective further by formulating the purpose in the form of a problem. Nevertheless, research questions are not inherently necessary. But if we are talking about empirical studies, then I would actually be less inclined to answer yes. The research questions is the tool we have to limit our task with a particular study. Thus, by formulating a good question, we can know what our data or material should be and how we should go about studying it. The research question, more than the purpose, thus shows us the way forward with our research, and thus also makes it possible to determine whether our research is going in the right direction. This does not mean that the research question that is formulated will always look the same throughout the research process. You can change it and modify it according to your needs and according to the insights that research provides. But as a guide for yourself, as well as for those who will read your work, the research question is indispensable. I will now quickly go through how to develop a good research question. I hope you will not interpret this as the only way to develop a research question, but it is at least indicative of how research questions are generally developed. Thus, a research question is developed in the following steps. But the first thing you often do is start with a fairly broad question. There may be something that you're interested in investigating, and you are also willing to take the time necessary to carry out that project. But although you have intent, you haven't yet managed to formulate your research question. Therefore, you need to take the next steps, which is to do preliminary research. In order to develop your research question, you need to find out more about the topic. This can often be quite a fun period where you get to read a lot of research on the topic you're interested in. It is a time for discovery, but also a time for careful work. There are those who want to skip this stage and go straight into research, but I would almost venture to say that the research results then risks being substandard. This part then usually forms the basis of the section we describe as previous research. I've touched upon this in another video lecture, so you can go there and see what I said about that. It's in the video lecture dealing with how to develop what article within teaching and learning in higher education, what those kinds of research articles generally look like. So you can go there and see what I said then. But in any case, this is an important stage, among other things, because it frames the field we're working in and makes visible what research gaps there are. It also makes us up to date on the latest research. After doing this basic work, then you can finally formulate your research question. This is because you now know what the research there is that has been done, and more importantly, what research has not yet been done, if there are any problems with that research, or if you have a perspective or material that you might think that might contribute to the understanding of what you want to study. So you can now formulate your question. Then, after that, you must critically examine your research question. And here you can think about the following things. First off, is it focused? Is it concentrated around a specific thing that you want to investigate, or is it incorrectly worded so that it becomes far too broad and thus too comprehensive? Thus, is it well defined? Then you can ask if it's researchable. Is it possible to get an answer to this question? I mean, might wish to get an answer about the meaning of life, but I can't develop any test that will ever give a satisfactory answer to that question. The closest I can come is studying what others have said about the meaning of life, but no further. So you have to ask yourself, is my research question, is it able to research this research question? Related to this, you can ask yourself if it's feasible. Can you arrive at an answer to the question based on the time and the practical constraints you are facing? It's pretty self-evident, don't you agree? But for instance, if your research requires large instruments or requires like 100 years to do, do you have the resources to finish this research project? The next thing that you should ask yourself, if the research question is specific enough, is it limited enough so that you can arrive at an answer to the question you want to study? So I might want to know how the attitude of the world's students to distance learning has changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, but I don't have reasonable access to these students. Therefore, it's more reasonable that I limit then my question to, for instance, Malmö University, whose students I can actually reach. Next, you should ask yourself if it's complex enough. Is my question broad enough? Sometimes a question can be too small. In other words, you don't have enough work to do with your research. You don't have any, so the question is too small, and that will not get you published, for instance, because nobody's interested in getting an answer to something that is quite irrelevant. But coming to the next question then is, you can ask yourself if it is a relevant question. Is there any point in this being studied for your field of research or society in general? If the question is only interesting to you, then it might be worth studying, but not with the intention of getting it published. So if it's only interesting for you, perhaps you should not do that kind of research question. You cannot study that research question. And then, is it ethical? This is sometimes necessary to ask. All too often in the history of science, people have asked questions that perhaps should not be studied, but they did the study anyway. Just because you can ask a research question does not mean that you have to study it or should study it. Similarly, many questions do have serious ethical implications, but should be done. However, if there are any ethical considerations to take into account, you have to thoroughly consider these before you start doing your research and developing your research question. After you've done this, after you've formulated your research question, you've checked all the boxes, then you need to reconsider your research question. After you've all done all this, you can start to do your research project based on the question you have. However, what often happens is that as you do your research, you'll find that your research question needs to be rephrased. Things happen during research processes that forces us to reevaluate what we want to do. Perhaps your material doesn't answer a question, or is it that it answers something that is all the more interesting? Maybe you ran out of time and you don't have time to answer the whole question, but you then have to narrow it down further in order to be able to say something with the work that you have done. Whatever the case, at this stage, you need to go back and modify your question so that it corresponds to what you have done, or it corresponds in a way that the answer you are able to give also corresponds to the research question. Formulating a research question is thus an ongoing process with the question you have evolving the further you get with your research. So the questions evolves during the research process. So those were some considerations when developing your research question. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you are free to contact me. Thank you.